Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm told that it's time to get the show on the road. Thank you for responding so well to that cowbell role that I played a little bit earlier this morning. I'd just like you to know that the cowbell that I used this morning comes from the collection of cowbells owned by Dr. Cornelia Kreplin, one of our exec team at AI Bio. My name is Steve Price. I'm the interim CEO of Alberta Innovates Bio Solutions. And I'd like to welcome you this morning to the 5th edition of Impact Innovations. Each one has been a tremendous success, plentiful audience, lots of good speakers, engagement of the speakers by the audience afterwards, and I would encourage you to follow that model. Your presence in the audience makes it worthwhile for the speakers, but your participation by posing questions just adds that extra for each and every speaker. Like I said, in the past we've had many good speakers, and today we have another slate of excellent speakers. They're going to be talking on subjects that span the gamut of AI Bio's business lines. We have 5 business lines, and I should just remind you that Alberta Innovates Bio Solutions is one of the Alberta Innovates group here in Alberta. Our focus is agriculture, forestry, and life sciences, and as I've said, we've got 5 business lines. We're principally a funding agency. We like to give money away. That's what makes us happy. We like to give money to researchers who do innovative things and create economic prosperity in the province of Alberta. So we've got a lot of good examples of that happening, but we tend to think that we at AI Bio go just a little beyond the funding realm. We believe that we're quite adept at gathering intelligence. We are quite adept when it comes to analyzing situations, and certainly networking is a forte for us. We strive to make connections for people, facilitate connections, and where possible, we try to serve as a catalyst for action. Now, I know you're going to get very comfortable in these seats in this theater, but before you do, I'd like to remind you that a cell phone going off in the middle of a presentation can be a very disturbing event. So please, turn your cell phones off. The other thing I'd like to remind you about is squeezing to the middle. There will be some people that arrive just a little late, and we would like to accommodate them without too much disruption. An essential piece of information for you, location of washrooms. Straight out the back doors, halfway up the stairs, swing to the left and you'll find a set of washrooms, or you go into the main foyer, down to the left towards the Rice Theatre, and you'll find larger washrooms down there. Emergency exits, through the back exits is the preferred route should you hear an alarm. You'll move through the back exits, and it's the library esplanade courtyard where people should be gathering until the all clear is given. Now, I know that many of you have already availed yourselves of coffee and snacks, so you know that they're available at the Schachter lobby level. And I would just like to indicate to you now that the presentations this morning will be broken into 2 blocks, blocks of 3, and there will be an intermission upstairs. I will once again circulate through the crowd with the cowbell as intermission draws to a close, and that is the sign that you should return to your seats. There'll also be snacks and coffee offered following the event. So there's plenty of time to talk to the speakers, to talk to each other, build new friends. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our MC for the morning. He helped design Daily Planet on Discovery Channel. He hosted CBC's Quirks and Quarks. He wrote a weekly column in the Toronto Star. He writes a column in Canadian Wildlife. He's written 13 books. He holds 5 honorary degrees. He's a member of the Order of Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Jay Ingram.
Welcome, everybody. As Steve said, this is the 5th episode of this particular program. First one under an NDP government, though. Mind you, if we'd done 40 of them, it would still be the first one under an NDP government. I'd like to welcome all of you, but particularly those of you who are coming for the first time. I can't guarantee satisfaction, one never can, but I will say this. I've emceed a lot of science presentations over the last few years, and I'm not hyping it or spinning it when I say that of all the ones that I'm involved with throughout the years, this one is the most interesting. I would say it's the most fun, but science presentations don't tend to sound like fun. But I will say this is one of the most interesting, and it's for this reason, that the research that you're going to hear about is both incredibly diverse and of crucial importance. And as Steve Price said, there are a number of areas of research, but you know, if you look at them quickly, you've got sustainability, food innovation, biodiversity, prion research, bioindustry, and biological greenhouse gas management. You can't choose one of those that isn't of frontline importance today. Food innovation. We're heading for a world population of at least 9 billion by the middle of this century. Prions. We've recently had another case of BSE, mad cow disease, and a case of chronic wasting disease in a captive elk. Both those diseases are still of concern. Greenhouse gases, sustainability, well, you hardly have to mention them. I've listed those because I think it's pretty easy to forget that it all ties together as well. Research in one area has a potential impact on research in others. So when you listen to these talks today, it's, I think, a good idea to be aware that it's not just interesting and important research in and of itself, but it has much greater and wider potential. And the truth is, while you know, people, especially outside this province, think that Alberta is only about oil and gas, the fact is that agriculture, food, and forestry are a huge part of this province's economy. Steve's run through the format. It was actually funny when he said we have 215 seats and 250 people have signed up, because that's what we call the Air Canada model. And I was hoping Steve would go on and say, so for those of you who can't be seated, we will offer you a different program at some future date. But before we turn to the research talks, I'd like to introduce and invite Art Freilich, Chair of the Board of AI Bio, to come up and make a few remarks. Art is an example, a really cool example of a Saskatchewan kid. Well, he was a Saskatchewan kid. He's still from Saskatchewan, but he's a farmer, he's an entrepreneur, and he spends a lot of time in countries far from Alberta taking the expertise, science, and technology developed here to make agriculture and lives better there, emphasizing that point that I made, that this research has global significance. Please welcome Art Freilich. Yep.
For that, well, those lights are bright, but it's good. I can't see who's in the crowd and how many people are here because I get very nervous when I speak. I don't have an order in Canada. I don't have 5 honorary degrees. As a matter of fact, I have 1 hard-fought degree that took me 5 years to get. And but I'm very proud of that. But I want to welcome everybody here today for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us. As I say, this is the 5th year, and everyone has been very successful. When I look at the name Alberta Innovates Bio Solutions, it rings so true today, because when I look at our forests and our farms and our fields, a lot of the solutions that we are going to find for today's issues are located right there. And often I think we we find that the forests, the forestry industry and the agriculture and food industry are viewed as being very staid and not very innovative and old-fashioned. And you're going to hear today, nothing could be further from the truth than that. I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes of where I see some of the needs and some of the solutions that we have for AI bio and the forestry, food, and agricultural industries. The first example I'm going to give is, if we look back not that many years ago, and we find companies like Hewlett-Packard, BlackBerry, Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, and how did we transform the information technology industry? We transformed that by young, entrepreneurial, technically very sound, very visionary people who took an opportunity and developed it into world-class business and lifestyle solutions. We are at the locus right now in agriculture, food, and forestry, in the area of biology, where we've got to encourage the very same thing to happen. And I would encourage our institutions of higher learning to start creating some of those technically sound, very good graduates that have that entrepreneurial spirit bent to them, that we can do the same kind of thing with biology that we did with information technology. And I know we can do that. So I would encourage us, we've somehow got to get this idea that agriculture, food, and forestry are not exciting industries. So let's see if we can make that happen. It's been mentioned 9 billion people by 2050. I think that's a fact. 9 billion people means a lot. There's going to be very few jurisdictions in this world. The CIA has reported there may be 5 or 6 jurisdictions in the world that are going to be net exporters of food and agricultural products. Canada will be one of those. So we've got to find out how we can produce more on less water, less land, and less resources. A huge, huge challenge that's going to require incredible innovation. One of the ways we've always done that in industry is we ramp up efficiency. We drain every piece of wetland. We farm wall to wall. We clear cut forests. We do all of those things. We all want efficiency, but we can't do it in the same way that we've done it in the past. We are going to have sustainable and efficient production. And that's a very big mindset change for many of us in industry. And this group in this room are going to be the ones that are going to take that next step and help us deal with how can we be very, very efficient and very, very sustainable. And you hear some interesting presentations today. We need novel products. The world has changed. Food is no longer food. We go through a fad about every 6 months. There's being health claims and non-health claims that are not scientifically proven. But having said that, we have to know much, much more about what is in the crops, the livestock, the forests, and how we can create novel products for use in industry and for our nutrition. There's a great conference coming up in Calgary, I think, Elizabeth, in a couple of weeks now, called Ingredients for Success. If you haven't registered for it, I would strongly suggest you do, because there we will be talking about how we can create the kind of science we need to take food ingredients to help society live and feel better. We're in a system of hyper-science. And along with that, a lot of what we do and a lot of what we fund as research and a lot of what the researchers do is falling on more and more skeptical ears. Science is so far out ahead of the general public now that we've got to do a much, much better job of explaining what we do and how we do it than we've ever done it in the past. And that's hard for us as farmers because we've never had to do that before. I'm sure it's hard for many of you in this audience who are researchers because you've never had to do that before. You all have your favorite molecule or your favorite piece of science. Most people don't understand what the hell it is you do. And we've got to do a much, much better job of that, or what I do. We've got a huge public relations industry in our sectors, agriculture, food, and forestry. The consumer is looking over our fences and in amongst our trees and asking some really tough questions. What are you doing and why are you doing that? And we have to come up with strong messaging and bring some calm to those audiences if we can. Arguably, we always fall back on science as being the message. They just don't believe us anymore. This is much more than just science. The last comment I'm going to make is about globalization, and I'm not going to talk about globalization as we traditionally do. In other words, the world is getting smaller and we need free trade agreements and we've got to sell to each other. I'm going to leave that to the politicians to sort out those things. When I talk about globalization, I'm talking about the fact that we've got a huge part of this world that is not nearly in the same situation as we are here. It's funny, you know, when I travel around the globe, and we do a lot of developmental work in South America and Africa and parts of Asia, and I hear we talk about food safety here, absolutely critical. When you go over to some of these countries, they're talking about food security. And now when I go to the Middle East, they talk about food sovereignty. And Africa is talking about food sovereignty and the amount of land that's being purchased in Africa by the developed world. And they're now concerned about their food sovereignty. I think we have to understand all of that. The 9 billion people are just not a statistic. The 500 million people that are malnutritioned every day, the 20% infant mortality rate in some countries of the world are not just statistics, they are real people. And we must do something here for the public good, not just for our own commercial good, and I want to emphasize that. I'm leaving today, going to Fargo, North Dakota. Why would I go to Fargo, North Dakota? Well, I have some business interests there, but the reason I'm going to Fargo, North Dakota is there's 3 U.S. business people and myself, a lady, 2 gentlemen, and myself, who started a partnership called the Shamba Partnership. We've purchased some land in Ghana, where we're setting up a demonstration farm for farmers to help them develop some of their indigenous crops, cassava, millet, but also how can we take some of the agriculture in Ghana and produce new crops that can be commercially viable. And the first one we're looking at is pineapple. Our goal ultimately is to have a pineapple processing plant in Ghana. So these are the kinds of things that I think we all have to think about when we come from a society as blessed as we are here in Canada and in Alberta. The last comment I would make is there's really only, I used to think there was only 3 reasons to be in business. And I think I maybe mentioned this once before. The first reason is to love what you do every morning and get excited about it, and I hope you all feel that way, because I do. When I get up in the morning, I can't wait to get to work, other than speaking, of course. I could have waited for this for many, many years. The second thing is to learn something new every day and talk to somebody with an opposing view to yours. I learned that from President Clinton. That's the only way you really grow and expand. The third reason is to make some money, to be sustainable in some fashion. And there's a fourth reason to be in business, and that is to leave a legacy. And that can be your time, it can be your intellect, it can be money if you have it, but I would encourage you all to enjoy the day, communicate with each other. I look forward to, I met many of you who are here because I've been here for 5 years as well. Thank you very much for coming, and all the very best.
That's good. That was I would say that's a picture-perfect introduction to what we're going to be hearing today. Now, all Albertans know that the huge number of oil and gas operations in this province carry with them environmental impacts. The most contentious is, of course, the emission of greenhouse gases, but like mining, ground and water contamination are also a problem. It may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but our first speaker is using plants, or researching the potential use of plants to remediate such contamination. Dr. Barbara Zeeb is a Canada Research Chair at Royal Military College in Ontario, and she and I had a little talk about the title of her talk, because phyto, P-H-Y-T-O, that's from the Greek meaning plant. And I thought, wow, phyto, why don't we call it something like the Fight Club? That'd be kind of funny, wouldn't it? Well, Barbara wasn't super excited about that, so I said, what about flight or fight? I really like that one. I think her email back said, ouch. And so we, like you always should, came to an agreement, and we now have plants for hydrocarbon remediation, which I think is a more appropriate scientific title. Please welcome Dr. Barbara Zeeb.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jay, for that introduction. You're making me rethink my title here. Seems old and staid now. Anyways, I'm really pleased to be here today. Indeed, I'm honored to be here today. And what I want to do is just spend a few minutes telling you about some of the research that my students and I are doing on phytotechnologies. So by definition, phytotechnologies is any time that you use plants to study or to solve any engineering or science problems. So I'm sure you can see there are many, many different applications. I really just want to touch on these three today. And in particular, the first one, which is phytoremediation, which is to remediate or to clean up environmental contaminants. And when we do that using plants, we're also restoring ecosystems, we're creating habitat, and we're sequestering carbon. Now, Jay said something about this being fun. This is going to be fun because plants are really fun. They're incredible organisms. There are so many different mechanisms by which plants can restore, extract, degrade, stabilize, and contain contaminants. And the best part is that they can do this synergistically. And that means that we can use plants to address all kinds of different contaminants, including metals, industrial chemicals, pesticides, fuels, etc. And every time we use plants to clean up contaminated sites, we're avoiding or at least reducing the need for more energy-intensive dig and treat technologies, we're creating new green spaces, and we're sequestering carbon dioxide. So I'm not going to bore you by going through all of these different mechanisms today. And I promise this is the one time I'm going to use the laser printer. I'm going to talk about rhizodegradation, which occurs right here in the root zone of plants. This is an area of research my team has been really active in the last little while. So rhizoremediation or rhizodegradation, we kind of use them synonymously. This is the process where it's the microorganisms excuse me, that degrade soil contaminants in the area surrounding the root zone. And when you think about it, this is actually the most desirable mechanism because it's occurring in the root zone, so the contaminants aren't even getting into the plants, and we're actually degrading or destroying the contaminants. So we're dealing with the whole problem at once. So again, my figure's a little bit complex here, but the key is that whether you're talking about grasses or trees, like in my little cartoon here, all plants release compounds from their roots. These are things like enzymes, low molecular weight organic acids, and these compounds attract microorganisms in the soil. And it's the microbes or the bacteria that come in and feed on some of these organic contaminants, breaking them down into smaller and less toxic forms. And so really, it's just the presence of plant roots that is speeding up this process of rhizoremediation or rhizodegradation. And one group of contaminants that is particularly well degraded in the root zones of plants are the petroleum hydrocarbons. And petroleum hydrocarbons include hundreds of different compounds, so all your constituents of gasoline, diesel, oils, lubes, tars, etc. Some of these components, some of these compounds are very simple, like the one I'm showing on top. That's a straight chain hydrocarbon, that's butane, and it's fairly easy for microbes to get in there and break that compound down into less toxic forms. On the bottom, I'm showing one of these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So these cyclic ones are much more complex. They're much more difficult for microbes to get in to break them down. They're much more toxic, and many of them are also carcinogenic. But as you'll see, plants can assist with this. So at this point, we actually have identified, and when I say we, I mean the research community has identified a number of different plant species that are actually capable of degrading PHCs or petroleum hydrocarbons. And these include many species of grasses, as well as legumes, even some wildflowers, and some trees. And things like hybrid poplars and willows are especially popular just because they grow very quickly. So what we want to do here is we want to degrade petroleum hydrocarbons to clean up the area, but we also want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we do that already by using the plants themselves, but we can take it a step further by involving biochar. Biochar is something that's sort of come onto the research scene a lot in the last few years. It's simply the carbon-rich byproduct of pyrolysis. So you can make biochar, which is essentially kind of charcoal, by pyrolyzing just about any type of organic waste under low or no oxygen conditions. And when you do that, you produce energy. And biochar also acts to sequester carbon dioxide. It acts as a carbon sink because its residence time in soil is up to 1,000 times longer than that of regular organic matter. When you add this stuff to soil, you also improve the soil quality. You're improving the water holding capacity, the nutrient cycling, etc. And that translates into bigger plants, larger plant yields, again, reducing greenhouse gases. And the fifth application of contaminant absorption is another one my group's been working on a lot. You can actually, if you build or manufacture the right kind of biochar, some contaminants will absorb very tightly to it, making it less available for uptake by plants or by soil invertebrates. And so now you're reducing risks to both the ecosystem and to human health. So over the past several years, my group, my students, technicians, some of my co-PIs, we've done a lot of different studies using different types of biochar that we very carefully manufactured and characterized, different plant species, and working with different contaminants. We do this work both in my greenhouse using pot studies, and we've also done a lot of field studies to sort of test this work. So I'm not going to show you a lot of data, but this is a nice picture, I think, that shows you just how good biochar can work in the soil to increase plant yield effect. So you can see with 2.8% biochar addition, you can grow a substantially bigger plant. So the goal here is to combine this rhizoremediation of petroleum hydrocarbons, which we already kind of know how to do, with the addition of biochar, which we very carefully characterized and manufactured to have all the characteristics we want, to create a phytotechnology that's going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions both during and subsequent to soil remediation. So we're going to do that by making the biochar itself, by replacing some of these more energy-intensive technologies, and by revegetating these petroleum hydrocarbon contaminated sites. And I think you can probably see there are going to be some applications for this right here in Alberta, also where I live back in Ontario, indeed nationally and even globally. We're going to find applications for this technology. So this particular project I want to tell you about that's funded by the Alberta Innovates group involves some petroleum hydrocarbon contaminated soil from right here in Alberta. And we start off with sort of greenhouse trials, and whenever we start these kinds of new projects, we start very simply with germination studies in the lab or in the greenhouse. And what we're seeking to do here is to find plant species that are native to the area and hopefully to the site itself. And this is just some cleaned up data here to show you that yellow clover and alfalfa were determined to be appropriate species for remediation in this case because they both germinated very well in the soil. So here in this little data graph, you can just see that the alfalfa and clover both grew extremely well in the contaminated soil, and biochar significantly increased the plant growth most of the time. And I promise not to show a lot of data graphs. I'm just going to show a couple to illustrate and highlight the results here. What you're looking at is the blue bar is the amount of contaminants, so the amount of petroleum hydrocarbon at time 0, and the red bar is after 51 days. And what you see here is that when we've planted these soils with clover, we've added the biochar, we get significant remediation of these F2 and F3 fractions. These are the fairly easy to degrade hydrocarbon fractions, the kinds of things that we'd find in a diesel spill. What's much more exciting, though, is that when we use the alfalfa, we also get significant remediation of these heavier F4 fractions. So these are the heavy fractions of petroleum hydrocarbons that include things like lube oils and some of the PAHs as well. And this doesn't happen in just 51 days. In fact, it takes 136 days to get significant remediation. But that's still really good because that's about one long growing season here in Canada. And the best part of all is that we are able to remediate these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Again, these are the ones that are really complex, they're really hard to degrade. There's a whole suite of them. I'm just showing 6 here. All these 6 are on the US EPA list of possible human carcinogens and have been targeted for complete elimination. And you can see that across the board, we get about an 86% reduction in these after 136 days. But this only occurs when we use the biochar. We need the biochar to make this work. And then, this is great. However, when you go to a contaminated site, when I go to a contaminated site, and I've been to lots of them because I work with the military and we've got a lot of contaminated sites, for the most part, you don't get a site that's just contaminated with one particular pollutant. So it turns out that a lot of the petroleum hydrocarbon contaminated sites are actually co-contaminated with salts. And this just has to do with the way the product is brought to the surface. Well, it's really difficult for plants to grow in salt-contaminated soils. They don't like that. But remember, I said plants have all these different mechanisms by which they can deal with contaminants. And so in some related work my group has been doing, we've been working with these very salt-tolerant plants. And the one you're looking at there is Spartina pectinata, and that's growing in my laboratory at the Royal Military College. Spartina pectinata is a prairie cordgrass. It's native to Canada, and it has this incredible mechanism whereby it takes up salts and it excretes them on its leaf surfaces and on the stem as well. And it sort of just forms that cotton candy type effect. If you just do this with it, it'll blow away. So it blows away and disperses by the wind. And so now what we've succeeded in doing is growing these plants and some other excretor plants in petroleum hydrocarbon contaminated soil that also has salt contamination. And again, it's the biochar that has been specifically manufactured and characterized that allows the plants to grow. So now we're getting simultaneous remediation of petroleum hydrocarbon and salt contaminated soil. So I'll just summarize by saying, obviously, I love plants. I think phytotechnologies should play a role probably in all, at least in most site remediation strategies. They reduce costs, they reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they increase green spaces, and they give us this option of returning to native or naturalized species. With the addition of biochar, which is in itself a carbon negative technology, we can improve many aspects of phytoremediation. And with that, I'll just acknowledge in particular my co-PI on this project, Dr. Alison Rudder at Queen's University, a couple of the biochar producers I've been working with, and all of my funding agencies, as well as you see there some of the current and former members of my laboratory at the Royal Military College. Thank you.
As we've already said, you'll have a chance to ask Barbara questions after the next 2 speakers, but because I'm already up here, I get to ask my own questions. And I know you're at the experimental stage right now with this, but could you give us just a brief picture of how, let's say I presented you with a 6-acre site that is contaminated, how would you go about remediating that using biochar and plants?
Yeah, we're at the experimental stage. We're actually ready to take this into the field. So this, and we've taken a lot of the other phytotechnologies, phytoremediation in the field. We've used plants to clean up PCBs, to clean up DDT. We have active sites. So to take this into the field where and it's been done before with hydrocarbons, but to take it into the field where we have co-contamination of petroleum hydrocarbons and salt, yeah, we're ready to go out there. We basically, it's like farming. We till up the land and we work the land. My students have farmed in some of the craziest places, the most ugly industrial brownfield sites. It looks just like a little farming project. That's how we do it. We go out there with whatever equipment is available. We plant the seeds, we set up irrigation if necessary, and we monitor the air and the water and the soil.
Great. It's really neat. Thank you.
Thank you.
I moved back to Alberta 4 years ago after living in Ontario for a very long time. And I've managed to sort of shed some of the Ontario stuff, like the Leafs. And the idea that it helped that the Flames are good this year. And the idea that Toronto's the center of the universe. I realize now it's just a planet. But I still have a little cabin in the woods north of Toronto, which I'm reluctant to leave because it's in the forest and I love forests. And I actually get a tax break every year from the Ontario government because I have wetlands on my property and I pledge to keep them going. Actually, I work with 2 or 3 families of beavers. I'm the only one that gets the tax break though. But I don't fool with beavers. So Shari Claire is in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology at the University of Alberta. And she's involved in a really cool project that takes this little example I just gave you of how wetlands on my land can give me a tax break. She's taking that idea a really significant step further. So please welcome Shari Claire. Good luck.
Thanks, Jay. I'm really pleased to be here today on behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Peter Boxall and Dr. Irina Creed, to tell you about a new and what I think is a really exciting new project that was launched in March of this year called Alberta's Living Laboratory Project. The central question of this project is really quite simple, and that is, can we create an incentive for private landowners to restore wetlands in exchange for a cash payment? And on the face of it, this is a really simple and pretty straightforward question. But the answer to this question is actually unbelievably complicated. And this answer is fraught with a number of different economic, social, and environmental issues. And it's these issues that we hope to uncover and explore and understand over the next couple of years. So some of you might be wondering, why wetlands? If we're going to take money and pay people in Alberta to restore ecosystems, why are we focused on wetlands? I'm an ecologist who studies wetlands, and so I think they're beautiful, amazing, incredible places. But I think anyone who's ever walked around a wetland can attest to the fact that these habitats are teeming with life. And per unit area, wetlands actually support more biodiversity than any other ecosystem on the planet. So they're incredibly important habitat for wildlife. In addition to that value that wetlands offer to wildlife and plants, wetlands also offer critically important ecosystem services to human communities. Things like climate moderation through carbon storage, water quality improvement of surface and groundwater, recharge of groundwater. All of these things offer direct benefits to human communities. But despite these valuable and important ecosystem services, wetlands have really suffered from negative social perceptions over the last century. And while these social perceptions about wetlands are improving very slowly, many people still see wetlands as wastelands. And because of that, the ecosystem services that these habitats provide are often overlooked and underestimated. And the result of that is that we have lost wetlands at an alarming rate across the world. Here in Alberta, it's estimated that upwards of 70% of wetlands in the central and southern portions of the province have been lost. 70% of wetlands is a significant number of wetlands. That's a startling number. And the majority of these losses can be attributed to agricultural land use. A lot of these losses have been historic. So over the last 100 years, we've been draining wetlands in this province to increase agricultural productivity. But as recently as the 1980s, the provincial government paid farmers to drain wetlands on private land. And while those losses on agricultural lands continue today, increasingly contemporary wetland loss in the province is being driven by urban land development. This image here is the city of Calgary, and it's estimated that between 80 and 90% of wetlands in the city have been lost. And as cities and towns in Alberta continue to grow and expand, those wetlands along the urban fringe are being filled in, and they're being replaced by constructed stormwater management facilities. And all of this loss since 1993 has occurred at the same time that we've had a wetland policy in this province that requires the compensation for the loss of that wetland habitat. And that compensation primarily takes the form of wetland restoration. So if I fill in a wetland under the provincial policy, I'm required to replace that habitat. And we haven't done a very good job of replacing habitat in this province under that policy. And we continue to lose wetlands in agricultural, urban, and industrial landscapes. And one of the biggest issues is that we don't have enough restoration sites. In fact, let me rephrase that. We have plenty of potential restoration sites. We've lost 70% of wetlands in this province. The difficulty of finding suitable restoration sites is that the majority of these restoration sites are located on private land. And it's very, very difficult to convince a landowner to restore a wetland that they've already drained. And so that gets us back to the central question that our research team hopes to address. And the big question is whether or not we can overcome these policy barriers by paying people to restore wetlands on private land. Can we create an incentive to restore more wetlands? And if we can convince people to accept a payment to restore wetlands on private land, the next big question is, how much do we pay? And that's a really complicated question, and I don't know the answer to that question because I can't log on to Kijiji and find what the going rate for an acre of wetland is. It's also complicated because what I may be willing to accept as a payment to restore wetlands on my property might be very different than what my neighbor expects to be paid, because my opportunity costs and my nuisance costs for restoring that wetland are very different than my neighbor's costs. And so this heterogeneity in price is something that we're very interested in. And so a big focus of this project is price discovery. The other question that we have is if we have a limited amount of money, and we do, we don't have an unlimited budget to restore wetlands. If we have a limited budget, how do we target that money? What wetlands do we buy, and how do we focus our efforts to ensure that we get the best return on our investment dollar? And by return on investment, I don't mean necessarily that we want the greatest number of wetlands restored or the largest area of wetland restored. We're also interested in the quality of the wetlands that are restored and the potential environmental benefits that we would receive if we did restore those wetlands back onto the landscape. And so over the next few years, we are going to be exploring these questions in the Nose Creek watershed, which is located in southern Alberta near the city of Calgary. This watershed was selected as our study area because it experiences a broad range of different land uses. And the different pressures in this watershed are representative of what we see across Alberta. And that includes intensive agricultural production, ranching, and urban development. And we see this as a perfect opportunity to test these questions and understand some of the barriers that exist to wetland restoration on private lands. So I've talked a lot about the importance of wetlands and why we want them back, but how in the world are we going to do this? The very first step that we need to take is to actually locate the drained wetlands in our study area. And in order to do this, we are creating a drained wetland inventory using state-of-the-art remote sensing methods. And for each drained wetland that we identify in the study area, we are then going to estimate the potential environmental benefits that we would receive if we were to replace that wetland or restore that wetland on private land. Once we know where each of those wetlands are, there we go. We then need to recruit landowners who have drained wetlands because we need them to participate in our project. Without drained wetlands, we can't restore wetlands. And so we've developed a communication strategy to engage landowners in the Nose Creek watershed. And our communication strategy has two main messages. The first message is we can't do this alone. We need landowners who are willing to participate. And the second main message is that if landowners do participate, they will be compensated for their participation. And that compensation will be fair compensation. We're delivering these messages through a variety of different mechanisms. We have a project website. We also are active on social media, so if you are interested in following us, we're Cash for Wetlands. We're also using more traditional communication methods such as workshops and print materials and advertising. But a big question for us is what is fair compensation? And how do we go about discovering the price of what people are willing to accept as payment to restore a wetland? And to do this, we're going to use a market-based instrument called a reverse auction. And in a reverse auction, we have multiple sellers who are competing for the budget of a single buyer. And in our case, the single buyer is the university research team. And so landowners in the Nose Creek watershed who are interested in participating in the reverse auction will formulate a bid. So they will tell us what they want to be paid to give us access to their drained wetlands. Those landowners will submit those bids to us, and our research team will evaluate those bids. And we're looking for drained wetlands that offer us the greatest environmental benefit for the lowest cost. And those are the drained wetlands that we are going to restore. And we will pay those farmers in exchange for them granting us access to those wetlands. Once those wetlands are restored, our team will develop methods to monitor those wetlands because we have predicted what we expect in terms of environmental benefits to be returned to the landscape. And we want to monitor those wetlands to see how good of a job did we do estimating those environmental benefits. So I mentioned earlier that this project, it just launched in March of this year. And so over the next 7 months, we're focused on creating that drained wetland inventory. And early next year, in February of March, we hope to run a reverse auction. And in fall of 2016, we hope to restore the wetlands. Following that, we hope to monitor the wetlands for a minimum period of 3 years, but we hope to secure enough funding to make this a longer-term monitoring project. Ultimately, we really do hope that this project creates information and tools that can be used by a variety of different organizations to help improve decision-making and to ultimately conserve and restore more wetlands on private land in the province of Alberta. And with that, I would like to take some time to acknowledge the project, the organizations who have provided our project both funding and in-kind support, including Alberta Innovates. Without this generosity, this project wouldn't be possible. Thanks very much.
So I can see from the timeline that you're sort of early on in the project, but I was struck by the fact that you're the information materials really sort of spoke to people's desire to be a leader. This isn't going to work without you. And the money was not actually a significant part of that. So do you have any sense, even as early on as you are, that in the end it will be people's goodwill that will dominate, or the fact that they'd like to get some money for their drained wetland?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think that one of the things that we as a research team acknowledged early on is that overcoming these negative social attitudes that I spoke about is a really difficult thing to do. And so our ambition in this project is not to change the way people think about wetlands. It's to appeal to other things that might drive them to make that decision. And the idea of being a leader, leading by example, being compensated fairly for their participation. These are sort of the things that we decided to focus on, rather than trying to convince them the wetlands were great and fantastic places, which they are. But I think the payment is a secondary piece to that, and we do think that that incentive will bring people to the table in ways that will engage them, rather than just talking about attitudes about wetlands.
Yeah, it's a variation on charitable donation where, yes, money is exchanged, but you're doing it because you believe in it. It's a perfect reflection of what Art said, that it's no longer just about science. It's about many other aspects surrounding the science. Anyway, thank you very much, Sharon. It was really good. As I mentioned, or I think I mentioned before, Alberta is, of course, not just about oil and gas. We're a forest-rich province. 60%, roughly, of the province is forested. I remember Impact Innovation, I think 2 years ago, when we were talking about the threat of the mountain pine beetle crossing the boreal forest in the northern part of Alberta and continuing east and devastating the pine forests across this country. And while mountain pine beetle is still operating, it's not quite as much of an urgent situation as was perceived then. But fires are still an issue, and we now know better than we did 50 years ago, when we thought every forest fire should be extinguished as quickly as possible. We now know that forest fires are essential for health of forests, but large and unpredictable fires, especially when they happen near towns and cities, are obviously an important issue. Mike Flanagan is with the Department of Renewable Resources at the University of Alberta. He's also with the Western Partnership for Wildland Fire Science. He's going to give us a peek at what the future of wildfires, forest fires in Alberta might look like. Please welcome Mike Flanagan.
Whoa, it is bright up here. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm a self-described fire guy. And my fascination with fire began early in my life. It was my first birthday. And there's a cake, and there's a candle, there goes my finger, and the tears start, but my finger stays because I'm so fascinated by that fire. And I've been fascinated ever since. I won't tell you about the story about matches in a town in southern Alberta. I'll save that for another day. My fascination with weather started shortly thereafter, and I consider myself very fortunate to work on fire and weather, two of my loves. And so the picture here, it kind of looks like a tornado, except for there's no debris. This is Slave Lake. I took this picture a few weeks after the fire in May 2011, and everything's been consumed. And this is an example of an unwanted fire. Jay is correct. Fires are good and essential for the boreal forest, but unwanted fires like this are not. And we can learn a lot from history. So this is a picture from a MODIS satellite, May 2011, May 15th to be precise. And you can see the smoke from the columns. This fire turned out to be the Richardson fire, and it burned the size in the area of Prince Edward Island. It caused slowdowns in the oil and gas sector that affected national GDP. And we're going to talk about Slave Lake in just a second. But it's hard to see, but there's a little dot here. And this is just before the fire blew up in Slave Lake. And by boreal fire standards, it wasn't all that large. But like real estate, it's location, location, location. It started just outside of town, and then a southeast wind blew it right into town. So, this is something that we can learn from. Over 400 structures were burned, about a third of the town was destroyed. Insurable losses were over $700 million. At the time, it was the second most costliest natural disaster behind the ice storm. Calgary flood has now surpassed that. It was very windy, which is typical. And you can see the picture of the fire coming in towards town, and there was little spotting, which are burning embers being carried by the wind and starting new fires. And they were spreading into town at this moment at 2 kilometers ahead of the fire, which makes it very difficult to manage a fire like this. So fire is common in the boreal forest, and you can kind of see from this diagram that, if you look at the boreal forest from coast to coast to coast, that's where the fires are. We burn about 2 million hectares in an average year. That's half the size of Nova Scotia. The last 2 years, we've burned double that. And is this, what we can expect for the future? Perhaps. But you can see there's lots of fire on our landscape. So what drives fire over a region the size of Alberta over a time period like a few weeks or a month? And these are the things you need. Fuel, that's stuff that burns. The vegetation, the needles and leaves on the forest floor, and we have lots of that in the boreal forest, so there's no problem there. Ignitions, lightning, and people. Lightning are responsible for most of the area burned in Canada. Alberta's a bit different. I'll talk about that in a bit. Weather, we call it hot, dry, and windy. You give me hot, dry, and windy, we can have a fire problem. Once again, Alberta's a little bit different than the Canadian model. And of course, there's people, and we build roads and cities and clear-cut forests, and we manage fires too. And Alberta Environment Sustainable Resource Development is among the best fire management agency in the world, and they do a really good job. So this is an animation. So, I say, what's the future going to be like? Well, what has the past been like? And you can see in the center there's the year, and these are the traditional blue is cold, and orange and red are hot. And you can see we're in the 60s now, and still kind of half and half. And then in the 70s and 80s, you start to see we're getting a lot warmer than we used to be. And, this is where we've been, and where are we going? And if you can click that to make this animation start, I'll be very pleased. Okay, so this is from our Canadian GCM. And once again, the color codes are the reds are warm and the blues are cold. And you can see when you see climate warming, it's not necessarily universal across the whole planet. There are parts of the southern oceans and off Labrador where there's no change or even cooling because of ocean currents. But the rest of the planet is getting very warm. And so we're looking at, some of the models suggest a 5 to 6 degrees Celsius warming for Alberta by the end of the century. That'd be like modern day Colorado. So a significant change in the weather. Now, I get asked questions all the time. Why is temperature so important to fire? We've found through a number of studies, for the boreal forest at least, the warmer it gets, the more fire you have. And there's 3 reasons for that. The warmer it gets, the drier the fuels, because as the temperature increases, evaporation, evapotranspiration increases, so the forest fuels get drier. Fuel moisture is very critical, so it's easier for fires to start and spread. Unless we see a lot more precipitation, our fuels will be drier. The warmer it gets, the more lightning we get. The more lightning we get, the more lightning-caused fires we get. So once again, more fire. And of course, the warmer it gets, the longer our fire seasons. Alberta has already moved officially to start their fire season March 1st instead of April 1st, so our fire season is already getting longer. The map on the bottom, you'll see that's kind of temperature anomalies globally for last summer. And you see the Northwest Territories was above normal, and also Sweden was above normal. And Sweden had the largest fire they've had for the last 40 years. And of course, Northwest Territories had a disastrous fire season in terms of the amount of fire. So here's a picture of Alberta. Alberta is different. I'm not talking politics here. And my GIS person put the orange for the fires, and that's not in honor of the NDP or anything like that. So Alberta is different. Okay, in Canada, temperature really does drive fires. So the hot months, July, August, or even June, that's when you get most of the fire. Not in Alberta. We get most of our fires right now in May. And most of the fires in Canada, most of the area burned is from lightning, not in Alberta. It's mostly human caused. Now, this happens during a period after the snow goes, but before the vegetation's fully flushed out, nice and green and lush and moist. So this period, 2 to 4 weeks, you've got dead grass and dead material. It's easy for fires to start and spread. And when it's windy, that's also good for fires. So instead of hot, dry, and windy, it's just kind of warm, dry, and windy, or mild, dry, and windy works for Alberta. And so what we're working on is to predict the spring flush in vegetation. When does it green up? And it varies a lot from year to year. Last year, it was really late. This year, it's really early. So this is Dr. Elizabeth Bobian is leading the greening up modeling. And this is an area where she's an expert. And we're building new models for fire occurrence prediction to use that information so we can be better prepared for when these spring fires come. Now, I'm going to tell you that the next 2 weeks are critical. We're setting up, there's fires in Alberta already, there's active fires in BC. We could see a fire problem this year. So, I see a warmer world, which means more fire. And I would argue that this is going to be one of the biggest impacts on Canadian forests. Those mountain pine beetle people have a good argument as well, okay? But disturbances will be important. I see increased risk as we get more fire in the landscape, and not just for communities, but for industrial activity as well. Also those smoke impacts that affects human health. So there can be more incidents like Slave Lake in the future. Through modeling like this, I think we can be better prepared for spring fires. We can reduce the risk, but we can never eliminate the risk. As long as we have the forest and we have ignition agents and hot, dry, windy, or warm, dry, and windy, we're going to have fire. Yes, fire is at the end of the road, and it's a big one. And I'd like to acknowledge all of the sponsors and support I get. Alberta Innovates Bio Solutions, of course. Alberta Environment and Sustainable Resource Development has been a strong sponsor. University of Alberta. There's websites, I'm on Twitter, and briefly, the Western Partnership for Wildland Fire is a three-way partnership between Natural Resources Canada, Canadian Forest Service, University of Alberta, and Alberta Environment and Sustainable Resource Development. And it's just spreading its wings, and check us out. Thank you.
So this is a bit of a speculative question, but spring fires are most important in this province, but spring changes with climate change and gets pushed earlier. And do you see that even though warmer temperatures will bring on fires, will the change in sort of the onset and offset of spring alter that equation?
There will always be spring fires in Alberta. As long as we get the spring winds, which we do, and as long as it's dry, in some years it's dry, in some years it's not, we're going to have spring fires. And it may shift earlier, and we're starting to see that already, but that's still going to be a problem. Day length is a bit of an issue, but it's really the dry and the winds that are driving the fires in spring in Alberta.
Can the fires actually exacerbate the problem that created them in the first place, that it's warmer, you get more fires? Do fires actually contribute to the increased warmth?
Yes, positive feedback. And this happens because the warmer it gets, the more fires we get. But I would argue the more fires we get, the warmer it's going to get because of the release of greenhouse gases. And this can be significant for peatlands, which you find in some wetlands. Peatlands are organic material that's 40 centimeters or more in depth, and they store a lot of carbon. That's approximately half the carbon. Work done in Indonesia suggests that peat fires there release the equivalent of 40% of global fossil fuel emissions. The peat in Alberta and the boreal forest dwarfs Indonesia. And if these peatlands burn already, but if they burn deeper and longer because of prolonged drought, that's a significant increase in greenhouse gases, which can make it warmer, which causes more fire, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so Mike, if I could ask you to stay on stage, and Barbara and Shari, if you could come up. And there should be a person on each side of the auditorium with a microphone if any of you have questions for any of our three speakers, and I guess we'll bring them together and have them stand here in the middle of the stage. And don't worry, you'll get coffee in a minute. So, but if you have questions, please take this opportunity, and we have one at the back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Adetoye from University of Alberta. My question is for Barbara. So I want to ask about the biochar. Is there any limitation on the feedstock for the biochar production? That's the first question. And the second question is this. I read something that biochar on itself can be used for bioremediation process. So in your research, what's the contribution of biochar? If, for example, without using the plant, can we use biochar alone? And what's the contribution of that to the bioremediation? Thank you.
Yeah, those are some really great questions. For the first part of your question, biochar can be made from just about any feedstock, so any clean organic material. People have used biofuels, people use wood, coconut husks, all kinds of things. And again, it's really, really important to characterize the biochar. Some biochar will have a very large specific surface area, and that will allow it to absorb a lot of contaminants very tightly. Other biochar will have a really good cation exchange capacity. That means it's able to absorb certain cations and assist with nutrient cycling. And that, in turn, sort of goes with your second part of your question, which is, yes, you can add biochar to soils, and the biochar will do different things depending on what kind of biochar. We kind of are now talking about designer biochars, because again, the characterization is so important. If I want to use a biochar to absorb contaminants, I'll make it in a specific way. I've done this to absorb PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, an industrial chemical. But if I want to use biochar that's going to help me break down petroleum hydrocarbons, I make it in a slightly different way. And then yes, it will assist with the degradation because it will often attract more microorganisms. However, the plant roots really do assist with speeding up this process. Good.
Another question there on the right.
Also for Barbara, follow up on this one. Do you have a plant can have a specific selectivity, like for particular metals or particular organic compound? Do you have like a table of list for what plant is good for what? I actually have industry, people want to get rid of certain heavy metals. Do you have any comments?
Yes, we absolutely do. So when we're looking at heavy metals in particular, we have some plants that work very well with things like nickel, cadmium, arsenic. And yes, we are very particular about the types of plants that we select. A lot of research has been done on these hyperaccumulators or hyperextractors. And there's some very good literature out there on that. Again, it's very important to be site-specific, though. So my team spends a lot of time going to the site and looking at what's native to that area, because we don't want to introduce other plants. And so, for example, there's a particular fern that can extract arsenic extremely well, but it only grows in the southern US and in parts of China. So we can't work with that where I'm in Canada and up north at a lot of the sites where I work. So it's very specific to the area, but we definitely have plants. I work with cucurbits, so I have very specific subspecies of pumpkins and zucchini, and they actually accumulate lots of PCBs and DDT. So depending on what the contaminant is, where the area is, and what the sort of site specifics in terms of soil type, climate, etc., we are very particular in the plant species we select.
And one question here.
My name is Christophe Danuma from AITF. My question is addressed to Barbara. You started with contaminated soil, and then you use plant for remediation.
Yes.
And once you do that, I guess the plant become contaminated too. What do you do with the plant? And then have you tried to compare, for example, some chemical used for remediation like surfactant or microorganism, and then which one do you think is more efficient, or have you tried some combination of them? Thank you.
Yep.
In case you're wondering, we're just Barbara's backup singers.
All together now. Okay, those are some really great questions, and I love them. So again, remember, today I was talking petroleum hydrocarbons, and I said we were working with rhizodegradation or rhizoremediation. That's kind of the most desirable mechanism because it actually breaks down those contaminants. When we're doing things with metals, metals don't break down any further. Metals are metals. And even things like PCBs, the industrial chemical, DDT, and other pesticides, they don't break down very well in the soil. So we use a different mechanism. We use the extraction mechanism. In this case, the plants are moving, they're taking the contaminant from the soil matrix into the roots and translocating it to the shoots. What we do, sometimes we do add surfactants to the soil, and it speeds up the process. And that works really well. But we have to harvest that material now. So what we do is we harvest it, and we do a lot of calculations and a lot of trials to figure out the best time to harvest. We harvest it, and what we have found is really good is to compost it. And we can compost it in a matter of about, depends on what it is. Switchgrass composts more slowly, depends on what it is, but we can compost it within about 90, 120 days. It takes a little bit of effort. And we've calculated that we can get that down to about 10% of the volume. So it's a volume reduction technology. So if you think of something, say the size of a football field, and you plant it, and it's contaminated with metals, and you plant it over a number of seasons, and you keep extracting, and you have to keep harvesting and composting, then at the end of the time, which is usually within about a decade, you've got this volume that's been significantly reduced. So maybe a couple of barrels of highly contaminated, highly concentrated material now that still needs to go to a hazardous waste landfill or to an incineration facility or whatever. But you're leaving the soil matrix intact, and so you're not losing that very important resource. The second part of your question, we've done some life cycle analysis to sort of figure out what's going to be best. And indeed, anytime you're able to leave the soil intact, things are generally good. But where this really pays off is when you have a contaminated site that's a larger site with lower amounts of contamination. Because it is very difficult for plants to very quickly take up or very quickly degrade extremely high concentrations. So there is a bit of a trade-off. And the one thing I didn't tell you about phytotechnologies is, yes, of course, they do tend to be a little bit slower than the traditional dig and treat. We can never keep up with that. But when you think about some of these tremendous amounts of pollution that have been put down over many, many decades, if we can clean it up within 7 to 9, maybe 10 years, we're still pretty far ahead.
I think we have time maybe for one more question before the break, and there is somebody, there's somebody there. And don't forget, if you want to address a question to any of the three at coffee, because we're going to force them to come out for coffee, that'll be fine too. So, yeah.
Hi, Scott Lundy from Alberta Innovates Technology Futures. My question is for Sherry. Sherry, I work with clients that range in forestry, agriculture, food, as well as environment. But I'm thinking of the farmer who is faced with the decision as to which crop to raise or grow, and other alternate uses for the land. And I just wonder how, in an industry where farmers are always concerned with what is my cash crop and how can I make the most per acre, I wonder how you and your project are going to convince farmers to consider another way.
So I don't have a mic, but can everyone hear me?
What, you can go back to the podium.
Okay. That's a really important question, and I think that the use of the reverse auction as the mechanism to help understand price really enables us to have conversations with the landowners about exactly what you're talking about. So thinking about opportunity costs and thinking about if I take that land that is now in production and I take it out of production and essentially now start farming wetlands, what do I want to receive as a payment for that new crop? And so I think that is part of the conversation. I think we have to start looking at wetlands as sort of alternative, not just alternative land use and things that are in the way on the landscape, but they're there with the potential of becoming new crops and that we can start to farm ecosystem services. The crux of that is that we have markets to buy barley and we have markets for pulp and paper. We don't have markets for wetlands yet. And so the really ultimate, the big question is, where does that money come from? If we're going to pay people to farm ecosystem services, we need people who are willing to accept that payment, but we also need people who are willing to pay. And so that's sort of the elephant in the room. Who's going to be willing to pay for these ecosystem services? And I think that conversation has to move into the realm of we all need to pay, because most of the benefits that accrue when you restore a wetland don't accrue directly to the landowner. They're larger scale impacts and larger scale benefits, like climate moderation, for example. So we all benefit in this room for that wetland restoration, and we have to be willing to pay for that.
Great questions. We're going to take a break back. Coffee is back where it was originally in the Schachter Lounge, and Steve will bring the cowbell. This is the only science meeting where the phrase "more cowbell" actually makes sense. Good work, everybody. Good, eh? Could I ask the few of you who are standing to take your seats again, and we'll get the second half underway. Thank you. And those of them that are still up there looking for coffee, there's no more coffee. So again, the second half will take the same format as the first half, 3 speakers. You'll get a chance to ask them questions after the third and last speaker, and then we will be back up in the same lounge for reception and probably even more food. So here's a fact that should astonish you. It takes plants 3 days, plants around the world, 3 days to produce biomass in the form of cell walls equal to the total annual output of the world's chemical industries. And those cell walls are made largely of cellulose. It's the most abundant organic polymer on Earth. Cotton is 90% cellulose, wood is 40 to 50%. And really, when you think of how plants build themselves, cellulose represents a giant store of solar energy. And remembering, as we've already heard, that 60% of this province is forested, this gives you the sense that as much as we're bitumen rich, we're also cellulose rich. And research into cellulose has now moved on to more exotic forms, including something called nanocellulose, a substance that has huge promise in terms of impacting sustainable, carbon-neutral, biodegradable materials. Behzad Avazi, whom is also known as Benji, is Program Lead Biomass Processing and Conversion, Bioresources for Alberta Innovates Technology Futures, but it's a collaborative position that he holds with a lot of spillover and work with Alberta Innovates Bio Solutions. And Benji's been instrumental in creating a pilot plant for the production of nanocellulose right here in Edmonton. So please welcome Behzad Avazi.
Thank you, Jay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Is all right? Everybody hears me right? So, title of my talk is about cellulose nanocrystals, or CNC, formerly known as NCC, nanocrystalline cellulose. Practically they're the same thing. Regarding my background, I spent most of my life serving and working with the pulp and paper. And to the extent of art, this is my passion. One thing that actually sits very close to my heart is serving pulp and paper. There's so much we can do, and there's so much can be done. So my home used to be Quebec. I live in there. If you notice a little accent, I was born in Iran. But back in '83, I moved to Canada. My education was in pulp and paper, graduated from McGill University, worked for a number of organizations. I also helped a number of mills, worked there. I had the pleasure working with them. So I feel the pain they go through, because the money, research, and the sweat that goes to making this simple paper is way beyond the cost that actually we pay for it. And as most of you know, back in late '90s and beginning of 2000, most of pulp and paper mills were succumbed to either merge or to shut down, because economically they couldn't sustain. And that has to do with a lot with what it is I'd like to talk about, making novel, completely new material out of simple fiber that can apply toward making the paper. So what is the role of AI Bio? I'd like to take you back a little bit in the past and tell you about a biblical story. Used to be a man, a rich man, wealthy man, had 3 sons. You may have heard of this story. Those kids never got along, always fight about everything. Absolutely everything. The moment that the father was passing away, he called the 3 sons and asked someone to bring wood sticks. He handed them, each of them one, says, try to break it. Sure enough, they applied force and they broke it. He made that to 2, so try to break it again. They applied a little bit more force, and they managed to break it. Then he handed them 3. They tried really, really hard. Unfortunately, they couldn't break it. So before he passes away, he says, unity is strength. And AI Bio acts as unifying agency, not just giving away the checks. They help us bringing upstream pulp producers with downstream end users and ask us to fill that gap and bridge between 2 entities. They look out for different research innovations. They contact us. They engage us with a number of scientists in different universities, especially University of Alberta, and they help facilitate that novelty into the next level. So what I like to do with CNC is so-called 4D, not 1D or 2D or 3D. I want the CNC to behave like the chemicals in our body, communicate, build something completely new. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of those to you. Unfortunately, he passed away. And he left behind what used to know wealth, clean energy, 17 camels. In his will, he wanted the first son to get half of those camels, second get 1/3, and the last one, the youngest and the naughty one, 1/9. So how are you going to divide this? I want you to ponder about it, and I'll get the solution to you. The purpose of this slide is the wisdom that AI Bio Solution brings to the table. They know exactly where to spend money, where to invest, how to invest to get a maximum return on the investment, simply because of ESBA, economic social benefit of Albertans. But this investment is not only limited to the Alberta, it goes way beyond our borders. So far, we managed to produce and provide CNC for a number of countries: Israel, Turkey, Japan, Brazil, just to name a couple of examples I can actually think of. Number of different applications as well. Athletic shoes, aerospace, automotive. So let me talk about what it is, what is CNC or NCCs. If we can imagine a fiber, we can break that fiber into the smaller building blocks, so-called glucose. These are the monomeric unit that builds actually this fiber. 2 of these glucose can attach to the ether bond or oxygen bond called cellobias. So these cellobias are the building blocks of the CNC. So depending on what you want, you can actually treat that fiber and get different materials in nanoscale. This is what nano stands for. For those who like chemistry, this is a chemical structure of the cellulose. The nature is built as such that every 600 angstrom, all the hydrogens, oxygen, and carbon are ordered. Because they are ordered, they have crystalline structures. And then suddenly goes to the small amorphous area where this order takes place. So we learned we can use these naturally abundant biopolymers and treat them with different solutions, such as sulfuric acid, and selectively break them down into the nanostructures. Why would you want to do that? Simple. By breaking this material to nanostructures, they have different properties. The aspect ratio, that is a width to the height, is completely different. They're stronger than Kevlar, lighter than any material you can think. So they could be applied in biocomposite for reinforcement. They could apply in concrete admixtures. They could apply for aerospace, and so on and so forth. Here is an example of CNCs in water solution or suspensions. One can see at 1.1%, suddenly at 1%, the color changes to a huge color. It's kind of bluish, cloudy type structures. And we take that under microscope. What we see is grass-like shaped material that is composed of those cellobias units. Usually, the height and the width is about 10 to 15 nanometers to 100 nanometers. Where do they come from? Well, they can actually be extracted from the forestry or agriculture materials. Forestry is preferable ones because we have 7 mills here in Alberta that do produce fully bleached pulp. 2 of them mechanical, of course, and the rest is, I think, craft, if I'm not mistaken. However, flax and hemp can also be used. Unfortunately, when we try to apply the same procedure for hemp and flax, we got some bluish dark materials simply because they contain different type chemical structures or ingredients such as wax, silicon, so on and so forth, that did not provide that CNC. But eventually, when we learn how to run, chances are we're going to take advantage of this feedstock that grows in our backyard. Applications. Obviously, it has to be a balance between the market pool in which you're producing material. And this is what we're also focusing on that area as well. So as we produce some CNC and modify that CNC as per catering for a specific application, we also engage universities through different programs in order to build and create different applications. The application of CNC could be applied toward fracking, drilling oils, and as far as biomedical and cosmetic and personal care. A number of you sitting in this audience do engage us. Of course, I provide samples, and we are collaborating in creating such a world that the CNC can find a home. Another reason to this is to diversify pulp and paper products. To be very honest and frank, we cannot compete with other countries that the fiber grows faster and it costs cheaper. So to sustain that productivity and economics, we need to diversify our product. So a number of organizations has helped us in building this pilot plant that allow us to connect between the fundamental research and the commercialization. So going from pilot plant to commercialization, chances are we do not have that fundamental research required for the homogeneity of the material that are going to be formed. And going from fundamental research without going through the pilot plant, chances are we don't have the know-how and why-how to the prototyping of this material. So this pilot plant plays as an instrumental missing link between the fundamental research and commercialization. Up to date, we have spent, or Alberta government has spent $6.7 million in building this pilot plant. As you can see it, it's quite unique, one of the kind, has a capacity of producing up to 100 kilogram. At the moment, unfortunately, the yield is quite low, so the scientists are focusing on how to optimize the process with producing CNC at a low cost. The agencies that have provided this money is AITF, Innovation Advanced Education, IAE, Western Economic Diversification, of course, AI Bio Solutions. These people constantly work with the steering committee, working with us and some of my colleagues sitting in the audience as a working committee, trying to troubleshoot, brainstorm to how we're going to get this off the ground and bring it to the next level. Of course, we have our challenges. And this is my main talk today. My first challenge is feedstock. What type of feedstock we're going to use? Or how are we going to treat this feedstock? So during the hydrolysis with sulfuric acid, they work quite efficiently. Could be, of course, fully bleached pulp. At the moment, we're working with Alpac. These are the material we use. Prior to this, we worked with a dissolving pulp to make sure that we mastered all the operating protocols in order to get a high and maximum yield without any surprises. We treat feedstock by fluffing it, pressing it, chopping them, to make sure during the mixture in the second level, which is the two digesters, they react quite efficiently. Here we are focusing on time, temperature, and of course, duration of the reaction. How much we're going to keep it there? Too much of it, you're going to produce those the glucose units, which is basically sugar. Obviously, this is not what the target of the process is. And too little, we're going to have lots of unreacted materials. So we want to make sure we tweak that process to get the maximum yield possible out of those pulp and bring added value to it. Of course, we go then to the centrifuge. With centrifuge, after the quenching reaction with water, we centrifuge to remove the material that is unwanted from the material that is wanted because of the suspension. And then we do microfiltration. But before doing that, we have to neutralize the acid. So we use sodium hydroxide to convert the acid to base, which is salt and water. And then we do the microfiltration, and then we spray dry it. At the microfiltration, the idea was to, rather than using tangential flow, which everything comes from the bottom up, maybe we should put a certain series of material in order to fractionate it. So the soup that we are working with, some of the reacted, unreacted, and sugar can be separated accordingly. The one that are kind of rough, if you like, goes to the oil and gas. That is not really important. The one that are quite fine and very homogeneous or uniform, it goes to the biomedical applications. These are the target. Of course, they eventually, we're packaging it. As we speak, we have a number of activity goes on the shelf life, the exposure to light, moisture, as well as the handling of nanomaterials is quite important because we want to make sure we are safe around this material. And at the end, all that's due not to me, but to my team, a quiet, dynamic, hardworking. You see a number of scientists here. And of course, a VP, Barry Mayer, and my former supervisor, Anthony Ania, who's working right across between agriculture and food, and of course forestry. It's been instrumental working with AI Bio Solutions to help us move this project forward. I'd like to acknowledge Alberta Pacific for providing also financial help in building that pilot plan, as well as the contribution in-kind contribution by providing pulp and some chemicals and consumables. Of course, AI Bio Solutions, thank you for having me here. It's a great honor to work with a number of people, not just writing a check. Seriously, they actually go through that projects very, 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 very efficiently. And University of Alberta, a number of scientists that they do most of R&D development behind this. To this end, I'd like to solve the problem. And here is the wisdom that AI Bio brings to the table. So what do? They go ahead and they borrow a camel from a neighboring village, make a total of 18. So if you divide 18 by half, 1/3, 1/9, you get 9, 6, and 2. If you add them up, it's a total of 17. So they return it back, they get the camel back to the original owner, and they solve the problem. And this is exactly how the role of this AI Bio solution is. Word of wisdom. So, to this end, working together, united we stand, we can enhance the possibility. Alberta is quite upfront, and I'm very, very pleased and honored to be part of this activity as I made my Alberta my home right now. So, thank you very much for your attention. Any questions, let me know. Thank you.
Okay, all I ask is that when Benji's up here with the last two speakers, please don't ask him, how did that camel thing work? Because I'm sure many of us are still trying to figure it out. So you say the pilot plant isn't up to capacity yet. Where are the big challenges there to get it up to the 100 kilograms?
Good question. Challenges lies in two different fronts. First and foremost, the yield is quite low. So we're getting less than 50%. For any organic chemist who's sitting in the audience, that would be just absolutely not. They walk away from it. We're getting less than 50%, which that affects the cost of overall operation. Because do remember, we have to spend money on water, which is quite expensive here in Alberta, caustic or sodium hydroxide to neutralize the acid, and of course, the spray dry that consumes a lot of energy. So if we can find a way to overcome these, it helps to facilitate lower cost and of course, application developments. Unfortunately, nowadays, when we approach different end users, dollar and the cost of the material is the #1 priorities. So is it a scenario of chicken and egg? Which one we have? So we're trying to tweak both. At the moment, we're trying to make sure that the feedstock is at its optimum. The condition where acid meets the fiber to hydrolyze it is at optimum conditions. How are we going to remove the byproduct? Or how are we going to use or recycle the acid, remove the sugars, and of course ferment the sugars to a corresponding ethanol so we can bring some money into it and get the cost of the whole operation to a point that actually can be feasible.
Good. Thanks again, Benji. That was
You're
fabulous.
welcome.
Thanks. Dr. Lynn McMullen is a professor of food microbiology at the University of Alberta, and I was telling her earlier actually that if the projects in microbiology when I was studying microbiology at the University of Alberta were as interesting as hers, I would have done better. I was going to say I might have distinguished myself more, but I think that would be an exaggeration. You know, I mentioned at the very beginning that it's not just the diversity and importance of projects funded by AI Bio, but the fact that they have promise in other areas. But I think that the importance stands out with some projects. And we have plenty of experience in this province, sadly, of the importance of food safety, especially in the prevention of bacterial contamination. And this is a specific problem that Lynn is tackling head on, trying to improve the ability to detect the presence of toxic strains of the common bacterium E. coli. And here's Lynn with her talk, and I had nothing to do with the title of this talk. She came up with it herself. Hello, E. coli. Are you there?
Thanks, Jay. Thank you for saying it right. Thanks for the introduction, Jay, and thanks to Alberta Bio Solutions for having me here today. It's a great honor to be here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing, but before I start, I have to tell you why we're trying to find if E. coli really is there. And I don't have to go very far to go back in time and go back to 2012, where we had a huge recall. This was the largest recall of beef ever in the history of Canada. There were 18 people that became ill. Fortunately, no one died from this contamination of beef, but 1.5 million pounds of beef went into landfill. And this was, of course, from XL Foods down in Brooks. I don't like it when things like this happen. It doesn't need to happen, I don't think. And I don't have to look very far to go back 20 years, almost 20 years. And this is a Newsweek magazine cover that was in response to the 1993-94 outbreak of E. coli in the Northwest United States, where 4 children died. And it was at this time that the meat industry actually said, whoa, we need to do something. And things have changed, and they have improved, but we still have problems. And one of the problems that we have is how do we find those E. coli? Where are they? And so detection is a real problem. And I'm going to go back to the XL outbreak, because one of the things that happens when there's a big outbreak like this in Canada, there's always a review. What can we learn from what happened at XL Foods? And this is a statement, this is a quote out of the independent report. And what they found in looking back, at the time that CFIA, or the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and the counterparts in the United States were finding positives, the laboratory that XL Foods was using did not detect E. coli in those same samples. So this really speaks to us needing better ways to be able to detect. We will always have sampling because we can't test everything that you eat. If we did, we wouldn't have a food supply. So we have to do sampling, and we have to try and find some E. coli. And the problem is in the meat system, we know that they're there. We know that they're there in very low numbers. It tends to be sporadic at different times of the year, and those numbers go up and down. So it's a real search, and really what we're looking for is a needle in a haystack. The numbers, as I say, are low. It only takes about 10 cells to make a human sick. So in my world, in the meat world, our haystack looks like this. These are combi bins of beef trim. This is a picture from Meeting Place magazine. And that's usually a combi bin has about 900 kilograms of beef in it. So you're looking for maybe 10 cells in that amount of meat. And we sample, and the industry uses statistical sampling plans to try and make sure that if something like a pathogenic E. coli is there, they're going to find it. So this is where Alberta Innovates stepped in. And Alberta Innovates Bio Solutions, along with some other funders, after the XL recall, put together a call for proposals to develop more rapid, more sensitive detection methodologies for E. coli, and specifically E. coli 157 and other serotypes in beef. And I looked at the announcement for the proposals and I went, no, that's not what I do. I'm a meat microbiologist. I don't develop technology for detection. No, ignored it until I got a phone call. And that phone call came from Cornelia Kreplin at Alberta Innovates Bio Solutions. And all Cornelia said to me was, Lynn, you need to talk to Dr. Pilarski. She's an oncologist. Why would I need to talk to an oncologist? I'm a meat microbiologist. What do we have in common? Well, Cornelia just encouraged me. You need to talk to Linda. She has a lab on a chip. She developed a lab on a chip for medical applications. Can you guys work together? Linda knows nothing about meat microbiology, but can you guys work together to see if we can adapt her technology to the meat industry, to develop something that might be able to help solve some problems? So what's an oncologist and a food microbiologist have in common? Well, we're both professors. We just recently discovered that we both won Aztec Awards in 2009. I didn't know, she didn't know, but we were sitting at the tables next to each other. I had no reason to talk to her, so it was Alberta Innovates that actually facilitated a really interesting collaboration. Because we put together a team, it's not just the two of us, there's more people involved. And we've been able to develop something that I think is really cool. And at the beginning, I didn't believe we could do it, actually. No, you're never going to be able to detect E. coli in less than 12 hours. I was wrong. They proved me wrong. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've been able to develop. So what you have here is a picture of some beef trim, and we start with some dirty samples. Beef trim's bad because it's messy. I like using ground beef. It's even worse because all the particles get into the mixture, and it's very, very difficult. And there's inhibitors in there that mess up the reactions. So we started with the worst case scenario. So on this piece of meat are 5 little yellow circles. That's where we sample, and we take about 325 grams of meat, put it in some liquid, mix it up, blend it up, and we might, if we're lucky, we might find one little E. coli in there. These are the pathogenic E. coli that make us sick, if we're lucky. We can't detect one cell. We don't have the technology to do that. So what we've done is we just let them multiply and divide for about 4 hours, and then we get enough that we can detect them. So we get lots of E. coli in that mix. We take a little sample. There's some magic that happens on what happens in that broth, because we have to get rid of the inhibitors. We're looking at using a PCR reaction. There's all sorts of things in samples that will inhibit a PCR reaction. So there's been some proprietary technology developed on how That sample comes out of there, and we put it in a little cassette. And it's a gel-based cassette. I have one in my hand. So what you see on the screen is in this little bag. This little sample can do 7 samples with a positive and negative control. It's all, everything you need for a PCR reaction is in here. You don't have to add any chemicals. So this can be done by someone who is relatively unskilled in microbiology. As long as they have aseptic technique, they don't have to understand really what they're doing. So you just put your little sample into each of the capillaries, and you put it in what we call the gel cycler. And this is a piece of equipment. It looks like it's about the size of a shoebox, and you have a computer that goes with it. And in there, we do the PCR reaction runs, and we get some images on the computer. And one of the things that I really wanted to know was, well, how low can we go? What does it take? How many E. coli have to get into each one of those capillaries for us to detect their DNA and be able to reliably detect the DNA? Because one of the things we don't want are false positives or false negatives. And we haven't had any problems so far with false positives and false negatives. So what we've been able to do, one of the results, and this is all for those of you who understand PCR, we're actually looking at milk curve analysis. So this is a picture of one of the milk curve analysis for a number of different samples with different numbers of E. coli. And we only need 2 cells that go into that capillary for us to be able to say, yes, this is an E. coli 0157H7, or if we change the primers in the capillary, we can do whatever serotype we want. So if I think about, and my experience with the meat industry is always, okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to give it to somebody in a lab. I don't want them trying to figure out what the little images on the screen is or what the milk curve means. So one of the things that we're doing is working with another Dr. Polarski, who is a computer expert, and he's doing all the software development and machine learning so that the pieces of equipment can learn about your samples. The more they analyze, the more they understand what is or isn't a positive or a negative sample. So one of the things that he's done is he's given us software that the first result is this. If you get a positive E. coli, somebody wants to know that in that cassette you had a positive sample. This is all they need to see. You can't ship that meat. It can't go into commerce. You have a problem. So it might, this is in the industry, it might trigger somebody to go get a supervisor and say, hey, and that supervisor may come and say, I want to know more about the samples. So there's a second layer of analysis where we can actually look at what was in each of the little capillaries in here and whether it was a positive or negative sample. So you can track it right back to specifically. So this cassette had 2 samples that were positive for E. coli 0157H7. A little bit different on the Shiga toxins, but they're not always both there. And there's always a positive and a negative control in each cassette. So it works really, really well. I didn't believe we could do it, but we can. And it's kind of been one of those surprises in life, and that's the joy of doing some science. Sometimes you don't believe you can do things, and it happens. So we've got this far. We've got a platform technology that we can use for meat applications, and that's been a challenge. Meat is what I call a really dirty sample to try and get DNA or RNA out of to do a PCR reaction. So we've developed a platform technology, and now we want to look, what can we do with it? And there's lots of other different applications that we could apply this to. I picked some of my favorites. My favorite up there is the sprouts. People ask me often, what food don't you eat? That is one of them. Because Salmonella, E. coli 0157H7, and Listeria have all been implicated in outbreaks from people eating sprouts. Spinach and E. coli is not unknowns. Cantaloupes with Salmonella is not unknown. Campylobacter we could do in eggs and chicken. Listeria and processed meats. We have reasons for wanting to do that. Salmonella in peanut butter and or chocolate. I really would like to try that because it's a very different matrix. Would it work with this instrument? I don't know, because we have some different challenges in trying to get the organisms and the DNA out of there. The other one that's really, I think, could be quite an interesting application is for water microbiology, and I'm thinking on an international scale, taking the shoebox size instrument that really doesn't take a lot of training to use and use it where they're having problems with water sanitation. It takes about 45 minutes to get an answer. With the meat, because of the 4-hour enrichment, we can do detection from cold meat to knowing what serotype of E. coli that we have within about 5 hours. Nobody else has been able to do that. So none of this would have happened if it hadn't been for somebody from Alberta Innovates Bio Solutions, specifically Cornelia. Thank you, Cornelia, who introduced me to Linda Polarski. And this is our team. There's a lot of people that have worked on this, but the picture on the left has the core team. Damika and Yana have worked with Dr. Polarski for a number of years, developing some of the technology that goes into the little chip. There's Patrick between Linda and I. Patrick is Linda's son, another Polarski. He is our machine learning Energizer bunny. It's the only way I can describe him. He just gets so excited about all of this when we get going. The picture on the right, I had to put a picture in of Patrick Ward. He wasn't around when we took the group photo because his wife was having a baby that day. And I'd also like to acknowledge Alexi, who is part of our team. And I think I missed a slide. I want to go back. Can I go back? Oops, not that far. There. I think this slide's really, really important as well. The initial funding, the call that I ignored until Cornelia phoned, was a consortium of Alberta Innovates Bio Solutions, Alberta Livestock and Meat Agency, Genome Canada, Genome Alberta, and the Ontario government who put together that first call for proposals. And that was just over 2 years ago. So we've come a long way. We're now working with the Alberta Innovates Center for Machine Learning, developing new prototype instruments and trying to get them to learn how to do this. So it's been a really interesting project, and I'm really happy that I didn't just ignore Cornelia's phone call. Thank you.
I want to ask you a question about the future. I mean, one would be how quickly might industry take this up, but let's set that aside because that has lots of non-scientific connotations probably. But you mentioned you want to expand it to different types of food that might incorporate different types of organisms like salmonella and peanut butter. Is the big challenge what the material that the bacteria are in? Is that the biggest challenge, as opposed to adapting it to different species of bacteria?
The technology would not change regardless of what the bacterium is. What changes in the cassettes is what primers we put in here to run the PCR reaction. That's fairly simple as long as we can figure out what primers we need to be very specific for the organisms that we're targeting. The challenge is how do you get a salmonella out of peanut butter and get it into an aqueous solution, because you have it in a high fat situation. Same with chocolate, salmonella and chocolate. You know, can we work with chocolate in Alberta? Are you going to fund me? It's a good fermented food. So the challenge is the matrix. And that's why when I initially sat down with Linda, she had no clue how you got E. coli out of meat. Nothing. That was all foreign to her. I said, we have to stomach it. What? We have to do what? You know, she had no clue. So by putting
you have to do what?
We actually stomach. We put it in an instrument called a stomacher. It blends it up for us. So I
want to know what it looks like.
It's just a box. It's just a box. But what it saves us, as I said, we blend up the sample. But we're not cleaning blenders. We do it in a plastic bag, and it just pummels it and breaks it up. So we can extract the organisms out of there. So there may be some challenges with other inhibitors that are in other matrices, so we need to expand and try it.
And while Lynn wouldn't tell you this story, if she goes to a restaurant and orders a burger, she makes sure with her professional knowledge that that burger is properly cooked. And actually had a discussion with a waitress who questioned the fact that Lynn would ask the burger to be cooked more. And said, well, we grind our own meat here every day. As if, okay.
The burger was raw inside, though. I wasn't eating it.
And didn't get consumed in that state.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks again.
Thanks, Jay.
We're going to take a step aside from infectious bacteria, as Lynn was discussing, to prions. Prions, strange, not living, not viruses, not bacteria, not fungi, but actually misfolded proteins. And this province, and I guess specifically this city, is one of the world's leading centers for prion research. Many of the investigators funded by the Alberta Prion Research Institute, which is part of AI Bio Solutions. And I don't think, as I said earlier, that we really need to make a case for the importance of prions. We have a 19th case of BSE in Alberta a few months ago, another case of chronic wasting disease. Chronic wasting disease, the only prion disease of wild animals, is slowly but inexorably spreading through the province with no real solutions exactly at hand to prevent that spread. So beyond all of that, prions are fascinating as biological entities, partly because they're not living and they're just misfolded proteins, partly because the way they spread mimics in some ways the spread of important human neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Ted Allison's a prion biologist at the University of Alberta. One of the things I should say about them is that they're very hard to study because the incubation period, the time from infection to actual evidence of symptoms, is in most situations years. So Ted Allison has resorted to using what you might think is a curious lab animal, the zebrafish. Please welcome Ted.
Good morning. I'm really honored to be here. I'm going to tell you today about our work using zebrafish, and a picture up here of this common pet store fish, a very hardy little animal, probably in some of your aquaria at home or your nieces or nephews' aquaria. And I did want to certainly begin with acknowledging Alberta Innovates and the Alberta Prion Research Institute. Our funding's partnership with the Alberta Prion Research Institute, as well as Alzheimer's Society of Alberta and Northwest Territories. And the funding they've provided us has really been transformative in the way we think about these diseases. And they've really recruited all these amazing researchers who've taught us so much about how we can use the zebrafish in unique ways. So as Jay mentioned, the prion diseases have been so impactful in Alberta, affecting our economy in terms of closures of borders to beef exports, and in chronic wasting diseases, healthy deer end up looking less and less healthy, and the disease is marching across Alberta towards our beautiful national parks. The end stage of disease in prion disease ends up much like something that's sadly more familiar to many of you, is things like Alzheimer's disease. So in prion disease, as Jay mentioned, we begin with kind of a happy, normally folded protein, and it ends up changing its shape. And that change in shape ends up actually being able to induce other properly folded proteins to then change shape as well. And that leads to the protein spreading through the brain. It leads to neurons dying. It leads to memory loss. It leads to confusion and dementia. It can even lead to things like seizures. And the parallels in these end-stage dementias are then reflected also what we see at the cellular level. So as these proteins spread through the brain, we see a beginning stage of, pardon me, we see a stage where the disease will begin in a focal point and then slowly spread through the brain. And this was first known to occur in prion disease and now is known to happen with proteins in prion disease as well as in Parkinson's disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, and even other diseases such as schizophrenia. And so we've become really curious about whether there's other links other than these important parallels I've talked about here between prion disease and Alzheimer's disease. And I'm going to tell you that, in fact, the properly folded proteins in prion disease and Alzheimer's disease probably are playing important roles interacting with each other in healthy brains. We think in understanding the roles of these proteins in healthy brains is really important as we try to develop therapeutics and diagnostics. So let me introduce you to the zebrafish. So the zebrafish is very common fish, very hardy, easy to grow, and we have thousands and thousands of these in our laboratory. They become popular as a complement to a mouse model in a lab, and a sort of a compromise between the thousands and thousands of small animals you could have, like a fruit fly. You can have a lab full of millions of fruit flies, or a lab full of dozens of mice, or you can have a lab full of thousands of zebrafish, and we can breed them very efficiently and have very powerful genetic systems in them. So the genome of the zebrafish is fully sequenced and very well characterized. We can manipulate the genome and insert genes and take out genes, affect the protein abundance very efficiently. One of the amazing aspects of the zebrafish is that it's very transparent, and we can see right into the organism, and it grows very quickly. It grows quickly outside of the organism, so we don't have a placenta in the way. It grows quickly from a tiny little fish to an adult, and as you watch here, a recently fertilized egg. This would be a yolk, like a chicken yolk, and the cells developing on top of the yolk. You see the time passing here in hours, now up to thousands of cells, and these animals very quickly, over the course of only 3 days, now are developing into these fully functioning little fish. We can line up thousands and thousands of these fish, pardon me, wrong button again. We can line up thousands of these fish in our trays and deliver the proteins to them, such that we can now alter gene expression in many of the fishes and affect the protein abundance and ask our questions about Alzheimer's and prion disease interacting with each other. So the zebrafish have become a popular biomedical model. They're used in things like cardiology. They're used locally in toxicology. They're used in aging and becoming popular in personalized medicine as well. We use them as well in looking at regeneration of neural tissues. So for 2 questions today, I'm going to begin by thinking about what is the function of this prion protein, and then I'm going to look at similarities between the prion protein, as I mentioned, with Alzheimer's disease, and see if some of those parallels can actually inspire us to think about new ideas for treatments and diagnosis. So in the first question, the function of prion protein is actually an interesting enigma or paradox, because this prion protein, as I've said, is a template for disease. And it's really abundant in the brains of all the animals we're interested in. And it's very conserved, so evolutionarily conserved, it's abundant, and so it must be doing something important. But we don't really know what that function is. So our approach is to remove that prion protein from the zebrafish. So we've used very advanced genetic technology to remove the prion protein from this zebrafish on the bottom compared to the normal fish on the top. And I've chosen this example to highlight the amount of detail that we can see in the zebrafish. Here we've made a transgenic animal where we can light up the brain with GFP, so this is a little bit of jellyfish DNA into the zebrafish, and we can exquisitely examine the detail within the fish and look at the various brain structures. Let me play that again. So looking at the brain structures, we don't really see very much difference within these fish. And as we zoom in, I hope that you'll appreciate that we can actually start to see blood flowing and hearts beating within these animals. So the zebrafish, when we've removed this prion protein, if you're not seeing much of a difference here, we don't see much of a difference either. The prion protein removed from these zebrafish looks, the fish look really quite normal and quite intact. So the prion protein doesn't seem to be critical for these early developmental stages, and this is quite similar to what's been seen in mice. So as we zoom in, so here we have the eye and the various brain structures, and we can see in really great detail the various structures and not see too much difference between these fish. We've looked in various other contexts and hope you can appreciate that in these deeply anesthetized fish, we can really see even blood flowing through the brain vessels and healthy, happy-looking fish. So as we move on to consider the behavior in these animals, we'll actually start to see differences. We had a hypothesis coming out of mice that these fish might be susceptible to seizures. Prion protein, when removed from mice, makes them susceptible to seizures. And David, if you could skip ahead in the video. And what we've done here is array these tiny zebrafish in 96 well plates, so a biotechnology standard that's very useful for us to screen drugs. And each little fish, we're going to track their movement and see if they're susceptible to a convulsant. In the top rows we have normal fish, in the bottom rows we have susceptible fish. And by tracking this movement and noting seizure-like behavior as they start to whirl around these little dishes, we're able to quantify what's happening. We have video tracking software to watch the fish as they move through these wells and get great detail. And that, in fact, when we remove prion protein from the fish, we do see a great accumulation of seizures. So again, very similar to what was observed in mice. Well, we wanted to drill down deeper into what's happening here, and we looked at the channels in the neurons of these zebrafish. So this is sort of akin to an EKG that your cardiologist might do on your heart, and if you want to understand if there's defects in heart function, you would notice differences in these sorts of traces. Well, indeed, we do see important differences in these traces, where in a normal fish, after a neuron sends a signal, it returns to baseline. But when we've removed prion protein from the system, that does not occur. And that actually is similar to research out of Calgary looking at mice, and they flip the axis here, but again, when the neuron fires, if prion protein is missing from the system, it doesn't return to baseline. The channel that we're studying here turns out to be one of the rare drug targets for Alzheimer's disease. So this maybe ties back into some of the Alzheimer's research as well. So as a take-home message from this part of the talk, we've learned that the prion protein is really important in regulating how neurons fire and how they are regulated. If they become deregulated, those neurons tend to die. And so this is about protecting the neurons and keeping them in a stable condition. We've learned that it's not specific to mice, but in fact that it's general to many animals, and certainly it's going to be generalizable to the deer and the cows and the people that were interested in studying the disease progression. As a final question I want to address with you is how the prion protein and Alzheimer's proteins interact. So what we've been talking about, I've made a cartoon here of green prion protein, or green prion protein here interacting with some other proteins. And it's in the same vicinity within a cell, at the outer membrane of a cell, along with the key proteins in Alzheimer's disease. That key protein in Alzheimer's disease, if it gets cleaved in a disadvantageous way, it makes this notorious little protein called A-beta. A-beta accumulates into oligomers, and this is what becomes toxic and kills brain cells in Alzheimer's disease. These A-beta oligomers accumulate, killing cells, and then about 5 or 6 years ago, it became apparent to researchers that that A-beta actually binds very tightly to the prion protein and has some important consequences in Alzheimer's disease. So we asked the question, if this little pit of A-beta is able to bind onto the prion protein, why not ask about this holoprotein, all of APP itself? And indeed, it seems like they interact. Well, here's a snapshot of our evidence for that. If we take now a young zebrafish, about 1 day old, if we reduce the prion protein, we don't see too much of an effect, as we've talked about. If we reduce that Alzheimer's protein, we don't see much of an effect. If we combine the two, in fact, the zebrafish is not developing well at all. The neurons in the brain are dying massive cell death, and the cells are not adhering together well. The zebrafish has another specialty. It has multiple copies of these prion protein and Alzheimer precursor protein. And what fascinates us about this is a very specialized niche interaction. It's only this version of the Alzheimer's protein and only this version of the prion protein that are having this interaction. and it's not something specific to zebrafish, because we can in fact add in, back into this system, now add in human Alzheimer protein or human prion protein and get back to a normal fish. We would say we're rescuing the phenotype. So whatever the specific niche interaction is between prion protein and Alzheimer's precursor protein, amyloid precursor protein, whatever that niche interaction is that's so special for keeping neurons healthy is something that these human proteins are doing as well. So I began by saying that the prion protein has taught us a lot about these other diseases, ALS, Alzheimer's disease, and how they spread. And what we're now starting to realize is that, in fact, these other diseases, like Alzheimer's, can now teach us about these diseases so important to Alberta, the prion diseases, important for chronic wasting disease, mad cow disease, etc. And so, in summary, we have this critical prion-protein interaction with this A-beta, and what we've now shown is that, in fact, the hollow protein can interact with the prion protein as well. So I'm going to end there with thanking the members of my lab and many great collaborators who made this work possible. And again, thanks to Alberta Innovates, the Alberta Prion Research Institute, partnered with Alzheimer's Society of Alberta Northwest Territories. Thank you very much.
So prion diseases are not, like Alzheimer's is not a prion disease, but you see this interaction. Do you think that the interaction between the, let's say I've got Alzheimer's, but I don't have a prion disease, so my prions are normal in my brain. Do you think that they nonetheless are contributing? Do you speculate that they might be contributing to the spread of Alzheimer's, which involves different kinds of proteins in my brain?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable speculation. It's certainly a question we're very interested in. So not the misfolded prion protein that is so important in causing infectious disease, but perhaps in Alzheimer's disease, it's very important to be thinking about that normal prion protein and how it's regulating the cell and the neurons and keeping them healthy. Yeah.
So another quick one. If normal prions sort of protect neurons, do you think that leads to the symptoms of prion diseases when the number of normal prions, because they're being converted to bad ones, is declining?
Yeah, I think that that's becoming more and more evident, and that's been underestimated in prion disease. That's an argument we're really starting to make, that when that prion protein misfolds, there's been a large emphasis on that being a toxic gain of function, right, as you're well aware from your writings. But in fact, that it's probably as important to think about that that's losing its function when it misfolds. Yeah.
Very cool. So could I invite Benji and Lynn back up? And again, we've deployed our microphone holders at the sides of the room. And if you have questions, and I can see one lining up already, we'll have a question period, and then we will go back up to the Schocter for yet more caffeine. Okay. Over here.
My question is to Dr. Avazi. In your process of your nanocrystalline cellulose, using sulfuric acid, to what amount of sulfuric acid would you be using in a 100-kilogram plant? And then how much sodium hydroxide would you have to use to treat to recycle that? I'm not setting you up, but I want an answer.
That's okay. That's all right. Of course, balancing out between what concentration of sulfuric acid does also do the job is important. Theoretically, they're talking about 58%. Currently, we're using 64 for certain species and a little lower for other species, like softwood and hardwoods, depending on where the feedstock's coming from. What we have learned on the bench scale is quite different than when you take it to a larger scale. On benchtop, we can get easily a homogeneous mixture, which seems that the acid penetrates better. When we take it to a larger scale, we see different. I believe the ratio is 10 to 1 on bone dry pulp, 1 to 10 sulfuric acid. And the amount that's required is based on this sulfate salt that is formed by using sodium hydroxide. If I do remember the numbers well, I presume that the amount of sulfuric acid is for 1 kilo is about, I think, 10, and sodium hydroxide to neutralize all the acid to its corresponding, of course, salt and water. Please.
We should talk later because I represent a company called Nano Green Biorefineries and Blue Goose Biorefineries, which is a non-toxic process with higher yields.
Right. The difference between using different acids is about the charges. Sulfuric acid, or so-called use of sulfuric acid in producing CNC, it produces the sulfonic group on the surface of the fiber that allows a suspension and stability. Of course, you could use different type and create so-called carboxylated CNC. That also has different properties. No one is better than the other one. Your process is quite different. You're using different materials, of course. If I use phosphoric acid, for example, because acid is what chops off those amorphous, I get up to 70% yield, which is quite impressive. Unfortunately, that behavior and properties that associate with the CNC is not there. So these are the pros and cons about what type of acid, how much of it you're going to use, and what type of feedstock. It's a combination of tweaking so fine that you can exactly get that frequency that you want to get your yield to be at. But I'd be more than glad to talk.
There's a questioner right here.
I would like to ask Dr. Lin. Is it possible what you guys develop to look into the viruses and bacteria and imagine in emergency services or EMS that before even our client, patient come to hospital, that we can do some of the quick analysis and find out what potential bacteria, viruses, and before we bring patient to the hospital. I see that much more implication on the healthcare than anything else. So to avoid the issues or some of the horrendous things what happen in the hospital regarding to the viruses and bacteria.
Yeah, certainly there's a whole myriad of applications in the healthcare realm. It takes about 45 minutes to run the PCR. As long as we have DNA that's specific for an organism, we can run it through the instrument. Again, it may take some finessing because of the kind of samples, but I know from Linda's previous work, they've been able to do cancer cells and STDs relatively quickly. So it could be used in that application as well, no problem.
At the back.
E. coli. So in vegetables, is that a result of the fertilizers, or is it a result of the actual vegetable itself degrading that sort of thing?
It could be from the fertilizers, it could be animals in the environment. One of the things that we know about the interaction of the organisms and the vegetable material itself, there have been outbreaks, and one of the classical ones was in Japan, where people, over 2,000 people got sick from eating radish sprouts with E. coli 157H7. They weren't on the surface, they were in the tissue. So if the plant's contaminated or the seed is contaminated, that plant material can grow around that organism and almost encapsulate it. So it's a mixture of what's in the soil, what we're using, the animals that are around. I love it when people say, well, I grew it in my own garden, it must be safe.
That's like your waitress.
Yeah. Do birds poop on your plant material? Absolutely. Once something is on the surface of a plant material, it's really hard to get it off once an organism has attached. So,
can E. coli grow on just about anything?
It's not about growth. It's about being there. Because the infective dose, especially for the sugar toxin producing E. coli like 0157, the infective dose is only 10 cells. I don't need it to grow. I just need it to be there. So we need to do everything we can to keep it out of the food supply. Right from what happens on the farms right through. Great. So,
would organics be a higher risk?
Oh, that's not contentious.
So, I actually teach for the food safety course, and this is something that students always ask me. So there is absolutely no scientific evidence to say that conventional or organic is any safer or less safe. So we don't have the scientific evidence one way or another to say.
Well,
Well, cantaloupe, I've always been looking for an excuse not to eat cantaloupe.
If you wash it properly, there's no problem. You scrub it, not wash it, scrub it. One of the things that we know is that things are there. We try and do everything we can do to reduce the risk for consumers. And that's what it's all about, is just trying to reduce the risk. Eating is risky business, but not eating is even riskier.
Do we have a... Yes.
This question is for Dr. Avazi, please. You showed us all of the applications for CNC. A wide array, everything from medical to fracking to plane wings. Can you explain a little more what makes CNC so special?
Sure. Although most of pulp and paper have actually mastered a lot of aspects and research procedures into how to optimize and extract pulp out of the wood species, different wood species, that when it comes to CNC, we're at the point of infancy, and we need to learn more about it. As we speak, AITF proudly holds 2 patents. One of them is on de-icing of the airplane wings, especially in the cold weather, and the other one is for oil and gas. As we speak, FP Innovation holds 24 patents. Schlumberger, I think, in the order of 40 or 50. Halliburton is not behind from that either, simply because they can behave diversely in different applications. My spouse is actually waiting for the day that he can apply the personal care, such as the nail polish, because of his properties that provides. Upon the reflection of light, that it can provide a rainbow of different colors. And she's looking forward to use that one day. In paint, coating, of course, because of its properties, shears, strength, and modulus that has provided. At 10% CNC, we can look at it and we see something like a Vaseline. It's quite viscous. Yes, if you give it a shake, it starts to flow. And that's a property that most of oil and gas industry is using to replace petroleum-based polymers for different applications, drilling muds and so on and so forth. And that's another patent that AITF is holding right now. So because of his properties, although chemical properties seems to be the same, but the physical morphology of it, and we're learning more and more, the way you dry it is actually going to produce or open up new niche markets. In fact, I think CPRO is sitting here. They have a unique process in which actually allow us to convert that small sparkles of CNC into the cotton candy-like material that can be used in biocomposites or catheters, biomedicals actually. So these are the properties that he's bringing, and we're trying to explore more and more. Advanced equipments, University of Alberta, SCM, TEM, TGs are being research and actually trying to figure out what are the applications, what are the properties, and what are the materials that you can bring to a table in order to connect between what we produce and what can be used in the real market. Did that answer the question?
There's a person with his hand up over here, down toward the front. Or
what were we doing years ago with hamburger?
Could you wait for a mic, actually, please? Because we have to record these. Thanks. Hang on. It's right there.
Richard Shahaney again. I was a quality control inspector in Canada Packers in the beef boning room during my college days. I don't remember killing anybody back then. I don't even remember any infected hamburger. We made piles of hamburger for A&W, who was the biggest customer at the time. Are we just that much more knowledgeable now of what's happening than we were before?
Well, I think the organisms have probably always been there. We just haven't linked human infection to the organism. I talked about the outbreak in 1993. It certainly wasn't the first one. The first one where there was a direct link between E. coli and ground beef and human disease was actually 1982 in the US. And some people died, but it didn't hit the media. So I suspect that the organisms have probably always been there. We just haven't been able to make the link. And we're much better at making links today between human disease and where those organisms came from than we have ever been able to do.
What about steak tartare?
I won't eat it. you've got ground raw meat and raw egg. So double whammy.
Have you ever had the one with cantaloupe, egg, and
I have to confess, I did eat raw ground beef ground with raw pork when I was in Germany. I tasted it just because I had to. And I have had hamburgers cooked too rare, but it's always been irradiated meat.
Yes.
My name is Christophe Danuma from Alberta Innovates Technology Futures. We have listened very good presentation today. One side we have Benji with CNC, and the other side we have two experts in detections. And my question is there any way to make those sides communicate together? I mean, for example, for the Alzheimer's disease or prion disease, we know that CNC is not toxic and is also biodegradable. Is it possible to attach those specific molecules to CNC and use them as a drug delivery or for diagnosis? And for the other side, you talk about using plastic to mix your material. I guess is to prepare your material before analysis. Is it possible, for example, to have some specific ingredient in those plastic to make like what we call composite in such a way that when we wrap a meat with that, we can release those active ingredient and detect if there is a E. coli or not? Thank you.
So let me start by talking about the size of the CNCs. Are you talking about the RIF in terms of the detection? Okay. Currently, we are working with a number of scientists in the pharmaceutical department of University of Alberta, in which are interested. If you notice, right around the glucose, you have hydroxyl groups. Those hydroxyl are easy, can be modified with different, of course, reaction. As we speak, currently there's a project ongoing. We're trying to use it for cancer therapy, in which we can actually tag into those hydroxyl groups. So in other way, we can eliminate the hydrogen, deprotonate it, and attach to the ether bond as naturally is being produced in tree into that specific drug delivery. And because of its size, it can penetrate, hopefully, selectively into those cells that are susceptible and creating that specific disease. And they have the facility and capabilities, not me, but they do, in making it either through the gel, capsules, or any other type of forms. And this is just a beginning. And of course, the role of AI Bio is to review this type of applications, examine the potential of it and its effect upon the economy and the well-being, so-called ESBA. And this is why they've always been instrumental in bringing us together, going through those reviews and saying go or no go, or perhaps fund that in terms of the first or second feasibilities. Your second question is about the packaging. Unfortunately, CNC is fragile. That means if you're going to use it to wrap the food against oxygen, which is quite impermeable, you need to modify that further. One way of modification is by using polyvinyl alcohol, or PVA. And science has shown if you do that, then you can make it more flexible. Again, the question falls in with respect to the economics. Can we use this material to be cost-effective for packaging company to protect that food against fungal or bacterial attack? So my job and yours, as a part of my team, is to make sure to get the cost to a level that can actually open up market for it. By doing so, we help our partners, Alpac and mills alike, also with the companies such as CPRO, to come up with novel ideas in order to make that a reality. That's how much of
Ted, do you have a comment?
I'm not sure if I'm broadening your question a little bit. Your first question is a good one about CNCs and the role in disease or drug delivery. And we certainly could see a role for our zebrafish as a complement to more traditional models like a mouse model of studying drug delivery. So if we had multiple variants on CNCs and I would understand from your chemistry that that would be possible, that we would be very interested in which were most effective and which were more toxic, etc. And the zebrafish, because we can have thousands of them at a time and array them out, and they're ideal for drug trials, that would really be a perfect platform to try and do that sort of work. Yeah.
Great. And I think probably the last question. Yes?
Okay, this question is for Ling. It's very interesting talk. I'm an engineer, so I will ask one or two engineering questions. Based on the talk, what is the difference between that shoebox machine you're using versus the PCR and the real-time PCR? Because for the E. coli detection in the lab, we can lysis a cell and culture it and can detect it within the time. Second one is you mentioned it's 5 hours can detect, but 5 hours, probably the XL already have the food already shipping out or packaged, and you're tracking back, you don't know where it is after 5 hours.
Okay, to answer your first question, the gel cycler, the advantage of it is that we don't do anything to the sample to extract the DNA. It's just the E. coli cells that go in there. Everything that we need to be able to do the DNA extraction and the PCR is in the gel cassettes. So there's no sample prep. So it's a very, very simple system. Typically when you're running PCR, you've got to extract some DNA, unless you're doing colony PCR, and there's a whole pile of steps in there. This is just a raw sample into the equipment, into the cassette, and put it in, push a button, and yeah, it's a standard PCR, but it's very, very quick. And right now, one of the things that they're doing with the Alberta Machine Learning is trying to get faster heating and cooling so we can get those melt curves faster. So right now, the PCR reaction is 45 minutes. We're hoping to get it down to about 20 minutes, I would hope. So we can shorten that time frame. One of the goals when the call for proposals first went out was that we have a machine that we can sit in the plant right beside the meat and detect. And because we have to do an enrichment step to get the numbers up because they are so low, there is no way any meat company is going to let E. coli grow right beside their meat that they're producing. So this has to go into a laboratory. As far as the timeline for shipping meat, one of the things, and we've been doing, I've talked to a lot of the people in the meat industry, including the people that now own XL Meats in Cargill, and what they want is something where they can make a decision within an 8-hour shift. So that they can make those decisions, and they know exactly that that sample came from that combi bin. They track it very, very well. And one of the things that Polarski is doing is developing a system where we can integrate how we track the sample into how they track their meat in the processing plant, so that there's a direct link between the result and where that meat is in their processing plant.
Thank you for all the questions. Could I ask the first three speakers to come up? I'm going to try and orchestrate this in an amazing, fantastic way so we can get a photo.
Oh.
And I'd ask you to hold your applause, which I know is going to be tumultuous, until everybody gets up here. And I have a couple of announcements while I hand out gifts to acknowledge the contributions of all the speakers. So this is going to be tricky. But I should tell all of you, thank you, Tad, that event survey is going to be emailed in a couple of days. It's really important to all of us that you take the time, it isn't long, to fill that out, because only in that way can we be guided by how we can continue to make the Impact Innovation event better. YouTube videos, presentations will be posted on the AI Bio website in a couple of weeks. Lunch is in the Schachter lobby upstairs, same place as the coffee break. And I would like, on behalf of all the speakers, to thank you for being a really attentive audience with great questions. And I think all of us should indicate our appreciation for the speakers. Well, it's almost like I did that before. And thank you all. We're going to head upstairs.